Welcome to the Moral Courage Podcast, lessons from the study of Rabbi Harold M. Schulweis of blessed memory, a podcast addressing today's trends and headlines through interviews and conversations with Jewish leaders, inspired by the works of Rabbi Harold M. Schulweis that make Jewish wisdom more accessible, inclusive, and relevant to today's complicated world. Our guests share their Jewish journeys and discuss how Rabbi Schulweis's wisdom provides inspiration and guidance to us today. Hosted by Rabbi Ari Averbach, Senior Rabbi at Temple Etz Chaim in Thousand Oaks, California, and board member of the Harold M. Schulweis Institute, an affiliate of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California.
Hi, this is Rabbi Ari Averbach. Welcome to Moral Courage, our podcast where we dive into the life and times and philosophy and theology of Rabbi Harold M. Schulweis, who guided so many of us and taught so many of us. This week we have a conversation with Mayim Bialik. You know her from Beaches and Big Bang Theory and Jeopardy and Blossom, of course. We talk about her start in show business and how that overlapped in a beautiful way with her bat mitzvah. We talk about her relationship with so many incredible rabbis, including Rabbi Schulweis. And we talk about her experiences on college campuses, especially recently, which just feels so prescient right now. So here now is our conversation. This is so exciting. We're here today with Mayim Bialik. Welcome. Hi. I've known you forever. I don't remember a time in my life when you weren't somehow part of like our vision. It's a little embarrassing. Mostly we grew up like watching Beaches like a few times a year, and just sobbing. So how did you, I guess first, how did you get into acting so young?
Well, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be in spaces where people know how to pronounce my name. I should just say that. It's really nice to hear my name pronounced pretty much exactly the way it ought to be. So very glad to be here. I was active in school plays as a kid. I was not, raised in the industry, as it were. I thought it would be fun to be an actor because I liked being on stage. I didn't really have the understanding that in 1985, 86, when I started saying these things, no one had prominent features on television unless they were like playing the ethnic character. So right. I thought I was going to be like all these kid actors and be in commercials and like buy a house and all the things that you would hear kids talk about. So my parents, it's kind of like the quintessential Jewish story. My mother was like, "You're going to be a star. You look like Bette Midler and Barbara Streisand, and they could make it, and you're going to make it." Which, like, I didn't really process that at the time. But then a year after I started acting, and I indeed didn't have much luck in like classic kid TV roles because I looked very different from a lot of kids. About a year after I started acting, this audition came through, and they were looking for someone to play Bette Midler, and my mother was like, "See, I told you." And I was like, I'm never going to get that part because I'm not a redhead. And she's like, you're going to get that part. And I literally, it was like the will of a strong Jewish parent, And so I went to 4 months of auditions where I was one of the only non-redhead girls, and they kept calling me back and calling me back and calling me back. And then, that movie changed my life. I filmed it when I was 12 and it came out the week of my bat mitzvah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Literally, I was on the cover of the Los Angeles Times calendar section the morning of my bat mitzvah.
What? What was your parsha?
I think I was Vayigash. Joseph revealing himself to his brothers. Is that Vayigash?
Yeah.
So yeah, and it was my mother was raised Orthodox, like by Eastern European immigrants, and neither of my parents had a strong real proclivity for organized religion, institutionalized religion, the patriarchy, or anything, but they did enroll me in a synagogue, and I really thrived there. I went to Temple Israel of Hollywood, which now is like, that's the Hollywood shul. It really wasn't then. I was there before Rabbi Rosov was there. I was there before Rabbi Mishagia was there. And yeah, I was raised in a very old school, Reform synagogue where, girls were encouraged to read from the Torah. And my grandfather had never heard a woman chant Torah. Wow. He wasn't even sure he was going to come to my bat mitzvah, but we lived, a relatively walking distance. And so my Orthodox grandparents walked to this Reform synagogue and he heard me chant from the Torah. It was a very meaningful day, and I had my party was very modest. It was just like in Miller Hall, which was like still, I think, under construction in our synagogue. It was not fancy. My grandparents wouldn't pose for photos on Shabbos. Like we had to go before. And So I had this really kind of conglomerate experience, and that was all wrapped up with also like becoming famous.
How did those two merge? That you're like a kid or not, maybe, but you're a kid growing up in that area where there's a lot of child actors, although most of them, I was a child actor, which means I did nothing. I went to a lot of auditions, did nothing. Um, and so how do you merge that and also at the same time, like normal life, grandparents, parents, that whole.
um, yeah, I mean, I think like it's an adult question to ask, which means that
Yeah.
as an 11 and 12 and 13-year-old, I didn't really understand what was happening. You kind of like put one foot in front of the other and kind of, go where you're pointed. I really did feel like I was, for a lot of my childhood and teen years, I really was, the subject of my life, not the object. A lot of kids have these stories of, kind of like being forced. And while there were things that were certainly uncomfortable because they interfered with normal life, I really enjoyed performing. That was true. That kind of, was always and still is true. That being a performer is a very comfortable place for me to be. All the other stuff was less comfortable. Fame, money, accounting, like business managers, publicity, like all that stuff was like really nuts for me and still is, honestly, even as a 48-year-old. Um, but, my parents tried to maintain as much of a kind of normal life as we could have. But like, if you couldn't tell by what I described my mother grew up like, there is no way to have a normal life when your parents were born during World War II and like my mom was raised in a tenement house and I grew up with the Holocaust looming very close. It was like kind of there right when you opened your eyes in the morning, one way or another. So I don't know what normal kind of looked like. And, I didn't come from money. So like we lived in a, kind of a crummy rental in Hollywood. And I lived with my older brother and my parents. We had one bathroom, till I was 15 and he was 19, like one bathroom for four people, which, that's not a lot of people's experience. And my dad was a public school teacher, but we were, kind of always struggling. So I had a different sort of upbringing also than most of the kids at my synagogue. I was kind of like that kid. Um, and of course, like I fit in somehow, but I always had this feeling of like, oh, but we're like shtetl people,
Mhm.
and these people are different than me. And I really felt that way and, kind of still feel that way in a lot of ways. Cause I think when you're raised like that, it's different. You grow up feeling different because you are different.
And so how you merged that side of it, like superstardom at a very young age, with you went back to school and got a PhD. I have it up here. I tried to read it, but I couldn't get past the first word. Hypo, anyway, that's it. Hypothalamic regulation in relation to maladaptive,
Yes.
obsessive compulsive, etc. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I don't describe it as going back to school. I went to school
Okay.
and as the grandchild of immigrants, you go to school, like you go to college and that was like a huge thing that my mom and her sisters went to college. Um and yeah, that my dad went to college and my parents had some graduate level work also that they did. So my brother had gone to UCLA. He was actually the editor of Ha'am, which is the Jewish news magazine at UCLA, and my brother was also a really, really gifted graphic artist in the early days of computers starting to do newspaper design. So
Hmm.
my brother had this amazing experience, especially like an amazing Jewish experience at UCLA. I really just wanted to have that. I wanted to have whatever normal looked like. I wanted to have that. So Blossom was, from the time I was 14 to 19. I was 2 years out of high school when Blossom ended. I graduated high school at 17 and I was just really anxious for a life where I was judged more for what I was thinking and what was inside my brain, and not just what I could offer, the world. So I was always very academically inclined, intellectually interested and curious, and a late bloomer to science, but really wanted to study science. And so that's what I did. And I was at UCLA. I did 5 years undergrad. I did a minor in Hebrew and Jewish studies. I studied Hebrew for 2 years, and then I studied Yiddish for a full year at UCLA.
Wow.
And I met my Rav, that's Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who introduced
Yeah.
me to Rabbi Schulweis and sort of the whole world of Judaism that has kind of influenced the rest of my adult life. But I was raised, at a Reform synagogue, as I mentioned, and I didn't know a lot about liturgical Judaism. I mean, I knew the prayers, and I actually loved prayer and I loved singing and I loved chanting and I was the shofar blower from the time I was like 14. So I loved being Jewish. I loved Yiddishkeit, but I didn't really learn about, Jewish text and really more traditional, halachic Judaism until college.
Did you know Rabbi Schulweis or
Um,
his
I, I,
his writings?
Yes. Oh, this was like so. Rabbi Chaim Seidler Feller, who's my
Yeah,
Rav,
amazing.
Schulweis was one of the many rabbis that he introduced us to, but with particular attention to the notion of being not only a modern Jew, but being a modern Jew, in the city of Los Angeles, which meant we had incredible rabbis, all around, and Schulweis was one of them. But also this notion that being a modern Jew means, having a responsibility to not only yourself, but to your community and to the world at large. And that was exactly the kind of messaging that we were taught, in the framework of Rabbi Schulweis.
Um, it seems like you made like really big decisions. Maybe some of it was made for you that your parents kind of pushed you, like encouraged you to be young Bette Midler in Beaches, which then developed into so many other roles. Um, but to get so engaged in Hillel, like I went to Hillel, I went to NYU, I went to Hillel, and I loved it. But the rabbi there and I were passing. It's fine. We had a fine relationship, but to like call him your, and I know Chaim Sadlerfeller, who's like incredible. How did that relationship blossom? Sorry, pardon me.
Um,
How did that relationship come to be?
yeah, well, I think part of it was that, both because of my life in the industry and how unusual, my teen years had been. I really was craving something, like I said, that had substance and something that was intellectually rigorous. Um, the God's honest truth is I didn't know anyone when I went to UCLA. I didn't have a very robust, social life in high school because I was mostly working, and most of the kids in my high school went to Ivy Leagues because that's what you did in the 90s when you came from the kind of schools that I went to. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you had to go to Ivy Leagues and everybody went back east. And so I didn't really have any other friends. And um, it's a very sweet story. I'm the product of Federation scholarships. So the Bureau of Jewish Education and Federation used to have programs where they would, give kids who couldn't afford summer camp the opportunity to go to summer camp. I got to go once to what was then called Camp Swig,
Uh
and I cried the whole time. But the notion of Jewish camp as a formative part of my education came in through the programs of the Bureau of Jewish Education. So there were programs called Dor Chadash, Chavarat
yeah.
Noar, and Chalutz. And, for a lot of kids, especially a lot of like the kids from the Valley in LA, it was like, oh, got to go to these weekends. And for me, I don't know why I'm going to cry. For me, it was an opportunity for someone whose family couldn't afford summer camp to like see like I just got emotional to see what
Yeah.
it was like, to be in a camp where like there's like food and activities and a pool and hiking and prayer, and it was really fun for me. And those programs were 5 weekends every year. We would go during the school year, and I really looked forward to them. I did that. I was able to do that through my synagogue starting when I was 10 years old, and then I went all the way till I was 19. And I'm still friends with some of the people that I met there. Many people met their spouses there. I was raised at Hess Kramer and Hilltop, which unfortunately suffered tragically in the fires that we've had here in the last
Right.
handful of years. But it was that led me to Hillel, because when I was new at UCLA and I didn't know anybody, I remembered that the time that I felt like I belonged was when I would be around other Jewish kids. And I literally walked into the Hillel building and I started by volunteering. I would answer phones. Back in the day, we answered phones. And I was a student volunteer. And then I started working with Rabbi Chaim, and he needed stuff Xeroxed for his study sheets. And I just sort of started hanging around the building, and I met people, and, I was able to kind of be of service to the community, meaning like it felt good to be part of. And then I started taking classes, and I told Rabbi Chaim, I mean, I had never met a modern Orthodox person in my life. This was 1994, 95. Like I just didn't know. I knew East Coast Jews,
Right.
and they felt more like me. And then I knew West Coast Jews, and like the boys thought that I was crazy. So I like it just felt like this disconnect of like, where do I belong? And so that's how I got involved with Hillel, and I started going to Friday night services. And my mother said, you'll never meet someone if you go to, like, you'll never have a social life if you're going to synagogue on Friday night, which was really funny. There
Right.
were many lovely, attractive, eligible bachelors and bachelorettes who attended, Hillel, and it was a really cool place to be, and it was really fun. And we ended up also being part of a lot of what we now know was the beginnings of the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movement. I was a student at the beginning of that, and so I did a lot of student activism, and um, we were protested a lot, and it was very confusing, and we didn't understand what was happening because we had all these alliances with all the other minority groups on campus, which started
Right.
being dissolved. And it was a very interesting time to be at Hillel. But I loved it, and I loved learning. And I said to Rabbi Chaim that I was raised with Yiddish. That was my mama lashon, my mother tongue. And he said, before you study Yiddish, study Hebrew. And I was like, I can read Hebrew. I don't want to learn Hebrew. And he's like, take Hebrew, and then you can take Yiddish. And so I signed up for Hebrew with an amazing professor. Her name was Nancy Ezer. She passed away recently. And she was the most incredible Hebrew instructor that I've ever met. You weren't just learning Hebrew, you were learning all about the culture of being Jewish, the culture of Israel, and it was fantastic. And I loved Hebrew. I loved the grammar, and I wanted to continue studying, and ended up with a minor 2 years later. I studied with Yonah Sabar, another incredible professor, and Arnie Band, and I studied with all these great professors who were teaching literature, and yeah, I ended up with a minor in Hebrew and Jewish studies, and then I did take a year of Yiddish, which was incredible too.
You were a known person back then, and so were you pushed to the front of, if there was a movement, there's the anti-Zionist movement, are you now pushed as the spokesperson, or are you able to hide in
No,
the
no,
middle?
it wasn't. It's a great question, but like without social media and kind of the PR machine as we know it now, it
Mm.
wasn't that kind of thing then. What it was is I was a student among students,
Okay.
and while I was famous and people knew me, I also I started a women's Rosh Chodesh group with a friend of mine, a Persian friend of mine. I conducted music for the a cappella group at UCLA. Like I did a lot of very just like normal student things. I will say that because I had operated in an adult world for so long, I really thrived on being organized, making lists, like getting things done, as part of the Half Shekel campaign, which was like a census program to try and, basically take a census of who were the Jews at our school. And so I did a lot of those things. I think I was known as being, outspoken. I definitely had, leadership qualities, but like my interest was like, I like to lead services. Like Rabbi Chaim taught me how to lead services, and I learned to be able to do that. And I had never studied with a chavrusa. I had never looked at the Gemara. I didn't know really what the Talmud was. So like I did a lot of those things that all of us were doing. But yeah, it sometimes helped to be like the one who can speak extemporaneously. But mostly we were, I was literally among incredible student leaders, many of whom became rabbis and teachers and cantors. And it was just a really special time, to be a Jewish student at UCLA in particular. So I really was among many who were leaders to me as well.
And then, I mean, you said your mom was not encouraging you of going to Hillel on Friday night. I feel like every parent that I talk to, like their advice to their kids right now, is that, was it a different time? Is it growing up in a tenement house, and knowing that Jewish is a little bit different, and don't be stuck as like the different one?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that was it. And I think, I was raised Reform and very, very um, separated from halacha or from halachic Judaism. So, I think for my mom and for some of that, generation, it was really seen as an impediment, to blending in. I think there is a lot of internalized fear and anxiety about that. It's part of our generational guilt and our generational trauma, of like, don't fit in, or don't don't stand out, like make sure you blend in. And yeah, I think there's also just some like, I mean, my mom will probably listen to this. Hi, mom. So like also some just good natured, like want to make sure that she has the most opportunity to like find a person to marry, because that is a very big ethic in the family that I come from. Is like finding someone, getting married. Like, I have a lot of Orthodox family, so I was an old maid by like 21. It was like, why is she not married? And at least that's sort of like the voices that I heard. It's not what I heard from my mom at all. But there was this notion of like maximize the opportunity, to meet a person. But it was always pretty clear to me that I wanted to stay in the Jewish community and raise Jewish children, which you can do with a non-Jewish partner, but it sure is easier if the person is, engaged in Jewish living. So,
Right. I mean, it's also so specific, like finding somebody who also loves going to services with the same at the same place and with the same as often as you do, and then wants to study, like, is this person, ideally also your chavruta, and just
yeah,
so
I
many
mean, well,
levels of what.
and no, and it's interesting because, the culture of the 90s was still very kind of polarized between like those who believed that women had a place in synagogue and those who kind of believed that women really should just stay home during services. And so there definitely was that kind of divide. I remember having, aggressive debates with Orthodox boys, about women's rights and women's place in Judaism. And one of them became a rabbi and actually had a really beautiful heart to heart with me about how when he was young and Orthodox and, yelling at me about how women don't deserve a place on the bima, that he saw that as kind of like a turning point in the conversation, and not specifically what I said. I mean, I was just parroting, what I had learned, especially from, egalitarian and observant sources. But this was a time where, for many of us, this sort of post-denominational aspect wasn't even an option yet. It was still very much about which box do you fit in and where do you go. And that's sort of where, for me, Rabbi Chaim was so transformative. Because like, what if it's not about what you call yourself, but what you believe and how you behave? Which
Yeah.
also like a complete, like direct from the Schulweis playbook, right?
100%. Right. A Reconstructionist rabbi preaching somewhat orthodoxy at a conservative synagogue and trying
Yeah.
to cross those
It was
lines.
post-denominational, like literally before his time.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things that he did were before his time, which is amazing. It's like I read his stuff almost every day and I go, how did he think of this 30 years before the rest of the world was on that page? The podcast is called Moral Courage. It just feels like you have no fear in saying what you believe, knowing there might be repercussions or you might get people to join your side. Do you know where that comes from for you?
Well, I think it's I think it's a mischaracterization because I have a lot of fear, and I have a lot of fear even when I do speak up because I'm a human who has fear, about will I stick out too much? Will I be punished? Will I be singled out? But courage is being afraid and doing it anyway, right? Like that's kind of what we're taught. And, much of what I was sort of, you know, incubated in was people like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and, the writing of Martin Luther King Jr. and rabbis like Schulweis, like Eddie Feinstein, people who were truly courageous. And I don't believe that they were as fearful as I am. So, I come by that fear, honestly. Being a public person and being public about a lot of things is very scary. But I appreciate, that recognition. But for me, courage really is about being afraid and doing it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the people you just mentioned, in their lifetime, they may not have been embraced as they were afterwards. I mean, certainly Heschel and Martin Luther King. I just did some research on Baruch Spinoza, who was like
Hmm.
kicked out of Judaism um,
Yeah.
for his beliefs, and his beliefs are now kind of mainstream Judaism.
Right. He was a heretic, but at the time, yeah.
Right. 360 years ago, he was a heretic and kick him out. And now we go, of course. I mean, like, it's very close to a theology I've heard you talk about, which is like the God as universe, God as what fills the universe with. Can you explain a little bit more? It's Schulweis adjacent, which is like not quite pantheism, and so therefore not Spinozic exactly, but like
Oh,
the
my
power
children
that
just call it my children call it cheating. They call my
cheating.
belief in God cheating because they feel like if there's not like a man in a beard that I'm claiming is, literally determining how it is that I walk up the stairs, they think that it's cheating. I mean, they're kind of being tongue in cheek. But yeah, I was raised with a very, traditional concept. My first sentence was the Shema. My mother had a lot of leftovers from Orthodoxy, and she would say the Shema with us every night. before bed, and I had this notion of like oneness and like echad, but like I didn't really know what it meant. And honestly, I'm one of those people who like had an old man in the sky image, but it very seamlessly transitioned to something that wasn't an old man in the sky, and then it was like the forces of gravity, and it was everything that's around us. And you know, uh, I don't I don't hate God. I hate the things that people do in God's name, right? Um,
Yeah.
so I have this very like, and again, I think my kids feel like I'm cheating with it because I can speak to atheists and I can convince them that if they believe the sun will come up tomorrow, that I share the same exact belief. What I choose to do around it is what distinguishes my faith from their lack of, structure around theirs. But if you believe with certainty that if you, take your shoes off and throw them into the air, that they will fall down to the ground, that's faith. That is the same faith that I have. I choose to have reverence around it. I choose to pray around it. I choose to meditate around it. I choose to, gear my life around appreciation for that and understanding of that. But to me, that's all the same faith. And it's okay if you call it something different.
I grew up with Rabbi Schulweis as my rabbi. And so to get to sit at his feet and look up at this booming voice who I thought was God in some way. And I remember at some point, I think it was him, but who knows, gave this sermon that, like, if you're thinking of God as an old man in the sky who has the list of who's naughty and nice, and he's got a long beard, this is Santa Claus, this isn't God. And you're getting a lot of things in our culture mixed up. And rather, Schulweis called it predicate theology. Like, what are the good things that you do for the world? Let's call that God. Does God feed the hungry? No. People who are godly feed the hungry. Does God cure the people who are sick? No. Doctors and nurses and loved ones who show up for them cure the sick. They are godly. They bring God into the world in that way.
Right. So mechnoflim verofechalim, right? That's what I was taught, is that these are the things that we are supposed to do, right? To be like God. If we're created in God's image, those are the things we do. And when we chant, when we chant on Yantif, on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, when we chant all the things that God is, when we recite the 13 attributes, the emphasis is not so much on praise, which is a component of it. It's how do I find that in me? And whenever people ask me, what do you want to live your life like? I say, I want to be slow to anger, right? I want to be compassionate, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I emulate those things? That's how I know we're made in God's image, because we have the capacity to pursue those ideals. Quick to forgive,
Have you ever had a pulpit? Has anybody ever invited you? Hey, it's Rosh Hashanah. Maybe Mayim Bialik should get up here and teach a little bit of.
So, the short answer is like yes, in small ways. I was trained under Rabbi Chaim to chant. I was the lay chazanit at Hillel for many years. I did it in different capacities. I was trained by Cantor Judy Dubin Aronoff, who I consider another one of my great teachers. And I was taught to daven by her, and I davened alongside her daughters, Ronit and Yael, who recently became a rabbi herself and is rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom. So I was raised in sort of that community. I consider myself the third daughter of that family. So I was raised to chant. My grandfather was a lay chazan in his little Holocaust, post-Holocaust community that he and my grandmother lived in. So I've used my voice that way. I have also sermonized. I've led services. Mostly I do feel like I'm carrying on the legacy of Reb Chaim, and most everything I say has come from him, and all of my teachers. But I really did debate going to rabbinical school, and I'm a proud supporter of Yeshivat Maharat, which ordains women as legal counsel and rabbinic authorities and maharats in all over the world. But I have a very strong affiliation and appreciation for intellectual and liturgical Judaism.
And you've done, so you haven't quite had a pulpit where you're giving the sermon necessarily, although if you ever want to.
No, unless you count the kitchen table.
Right,
in
that's
my
great.
house.
But you do have, a larger platform than any pulpit rabbi has, which is YouTube videos and podcasts that you've had throughout the years.
Yes. And I wrote for Kveller. And did a lot of Jewish content for them. I wrote in the early days of kind of mom blogging. I wrote about the powerful experience of mikveh and some of the philosophy behind mikveh, and how as a modern woman I embraced that custom for all the years that I was married. And I've written about my son's Brit Milah. I've written a lot about Jewish holidays, and I have done some videos. Like My Jewish Learning was a place that I would often do videos for. It's one of the places that it's nicest to be able to even teach non-Jewish people about Judaism. A lot of Jews appreciate what I put out there, also for visibility. But it's also really nice to be able to teach people, because there's clearly a lot of misunderstanding about who Jews are and what we stand for and what Israel means to us and how we observe holidays and what we believe. So it's pretty amazing to be able to do that. Thank you for listening to the Moral Courage podcast. We are produced by the Harold M. Schulweis Institute at Valley Beth Shalom, which supports these podcasts in addition to educational programs within Valley Beth Shalom, the Schulweis Library, changing exhibitions at the Liner Chapel at VBS, Jewish World Watch, and the Jewish Community Children's Choir. The Moral Courage podcast is hosted by Rabbi Ari Averbach. Our consulting producer is Esther Kostanowitz. Our technical producer is Eric Weiser. We are grateful for the support of the Institute and Haley Lazitsky-Weiser at SadCon Productions. To learn more about Rabbi Schulweis or to make a donation to help support these podcasts, visit the Institute website at hmsi.org.